This is Jay Carpenter of the PhoneWord Forum. Today is Wednesday, May the 30th, 2012. It's approximately 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and today we are talking about the state of the public switch telephone network. Currently have Tom Ogle on the line. And we'll see who else joins us. Tom, did you have a chance to read the pieces that I circulated?
I did. At least the first one by Mr. Geddes.
Right. I'm on the website for the FCC right now, and I'm trying to determine, have they had any more, do you know if they've had any more transitional PSTN transition committee meetings?
Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't looked on it for probably 3 or 4 weeks. Probably not since the last call. I think I looked about the day before the last call.
Well, I see the CSRC is having a meeting on June the 6th, and I'm looking for the other meetings.
Isn't that the committee that Mr. Shockey's on?
Right.
I mean, I did notice that he was one of the guest speakers, one of the lunch speakers at the second thing from the Wharton document that you circulated.
Right. Yeah, he was, and I'm looking at the past calendar of events. So I know that the transition, okay, here's the Technical Advisory Board. This is for First Responder, met on April the 23rd. And, whoops, what happened there? And, let's see. I haven't had a chance to take a look at that. Looks like CSRC met on March the 22nd.
And has Aaliyah's committee had another meeting?
I don't know. The new head of SMS 800 Inc., Tom Fitzgerald, sent out an item requesting that the Restborgs declare their related and associated entities, and I was tardy in sending mine back, but that's about the last that I've seen. And there was language in there saying that there would be some sort of Restborg community meetings or discussions or so forth for the transition to a new governance structure. But I haven't heard from Aaliyah. I was hoping she would join the call today, so I don't know. Looks like it's just going to be you and me on the call today.
But I mean, Mr. Fitzgerald sending that out, is he? Do you think he's trying to get the groups that have maybe 6 different IDs or 10 different IDs to get down to just one?
Well, the letter itself was saying that this was a survey or information gathering exercise to establish sort of the foundation for representation on the new governance structure.
Okay.
So that's what the the letter basically said. So I just did a review of the FCC calendar. It looks like CISRIC has been meeting. It looks like the first responder portion of the Technical Advisory Council has been meeting, but I'm not seeing anything else that's jumping out at me other than those groups. So what? Anything you would like to talk about today?
Well, I guess there are a couple of comments in the Geddes document. If you want to.
Sure.
If you want to get to that.
Yeah.
Maybe just a couple of paragraphs in, 5 or 6 paragraphs in, he alludes to Comcast launched an over-the-top VoIP product this week.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume that's, 2 or 3 weeks ago now?
Probably.
Are you familiar with what that product is?
I am not.
Okay.
I know that.
And then he just went on to say, and soon every telco will need one. So, and I don't do any business with Comcast, so.
Yeah. Well, Martin Geddes and his colleague Dean Bubley have written a lot about over-the-top telco products that are possible and might be emerging. They actually do workshops that focus on what the telcos could do with over-the-top products, and they've written papers and so forth. But to my knowledge, I think Telefonica from Spain seems to be working on or has launched something that's over the top. Rogers Communications in Canada has launched a product that looks like it's kind of like an Enum Lite, and I can't remember the name of it, but those are a couple that come to mind. So
in the following paragraph, when he's talking about mobile shifts voice use away from traditional PSTN-like numbering, is that what you're talking about when you talk about an Enum Lite type thing?
No.
Okay, so you're not talking about number mapping necessarily.
What I interpret that Martin is talking about there is, the necessity to stick with the traditional telephone numbering plan once, carriers and others go over the top.
Mm-hmm.
Just like I was mentioning in San Diego in April of 2011, that there's nothing that requires the telephone numbering system once you're over the top. So,
from a signaling point of view, for example.
Yeah.
Okay.
And addressing.
Okay.
So I think what he's saying there is that the field is wide open once you're over the top in terms of the addressing scheme, and I'm trying to look for exactly what he says there. Where is it? Which subheading is that under?
PS10 does not exist in isolation.
Oh, right.
The second paragraph.
Right. There are numerous scenarios. Let's see. Right. So right in the first sentence he says, this process is strongest outside the U.S., but will have a spillover inside the U.S. at some point. There will be an effect on the PSTN if mobile shifts voice use away from traditional PSTN-like numbering or calling patterns. So what I believe Martin is saying there is that, once there's a whole new ecosystem where, voice, data, everything's going over the top, then the numbering system, the traditional telephone numbering system, is only kind of a matter of habit, and
Right.
you don't really.
Because isn't really what he's getting at there. The data, for example, has nothing to do with the numbering scheme. I mean, the numbering scheme in that particular setting is only for billing purposes.
Well, it's for billing purposes in the PSTN.
Right. Okay.
And you could bill on pretty much anything. IP addresses, email addresses. It's all telephone numbers, email addresses, internet domains, IP addresses. Those are all just addresses.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, in many respects, they're interchangeable or could be interchangeable, especially in a enum environment where you just, each subscriber has a list of exchange, addresses that they have some sort of involvement with.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So in that environment, you can start to dial email address to telephone number or internet domain to telephone number. In fact, that Cider company has, tried to initiate something like that, where you can dial an internet domain and connect to a telephone call. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Isn't that just a SIP call?
No, SIP is kind of different.
Okay, how?
SIP does something that's enum-like, only it doesn't necessarily use enum. So a SIP basically stands for Session Initiation Protocol, and it just means that when I put in a telephone number or maybe an email address or SIP address, there's a lookup that occurs with a SIP hosting company, and then they return the endpoints to make the connection. Does that make sense?
So it requires a third party.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Interestingly enough, I've been reading about there seems to be a growing interest among some of the people that are, I would say, on the cutting edge of telecommunications and media delivery of moving away from SIP. So,
because of that, or because why?
Well, I think primarily because of the complexity of SIP, and SIP has some. It has, I would call it some limitations, and I'm not a SIP expert, but from what I've read among the the engineers in the know, I think there could be a growing interest in routing using methods other than SIP. For whatever that's worth. And I know that would not go well with some of the folks that have spent a lot of time working on SIP and ushering in SIP. So did you have any other thoughts on?
Well, a few paragraphs deeper into this Geddes document, there's something else that I thought was interesting when he was talking about, excuse me, just the reliability of the internet versus the PSTN. You know, and I mean, you can't go from fat to fatter in every direction. I mean, at some point, yes, you have to go to thin. And I mean, ultimately, how I read that is that the internet in and of itself has limitations. You know, where even though the PSTN is maybe viewed by many as antiquated, it is predictable and it is stable. What are your thoughts on that? Are you interpreting his comments in that paragraph the same way?
Well, I think he's saying two very important things in this. I think he's bringing up the unstable nature of both the PSTN as well as the internet. So,
and that they are going to have to coexist?
No. I think Martin is saying, as well as Rich Shockey has said, that the PSTN has been basically antiquated for so long and neglected for so long that it's in jeopardy of having a
catastrophic malfunction.
Catastrophic breakdown that won't be repairable.
Right.
Because the equipment's so old and the base of talent is so thin to run, to work on that old stuff that, when it breaks down, it's going to be broken. Mm-hmm. And then I think Martin is saying that it's misleading to think that you can just add more and more capacity to the internet and expect it to, expand in capacity. Mm-hmm. Which I didn't understand until, Martin started talking about it and I started reading his work on contention management. But that's, it makes total sense, especially when he was on, one of our calls a couple months ago, and he said he drew the analogy that the internet is like ringing a bell. And, you can't just keep ringing a bell louder and louder and expect to get more clarity. And that's the way I interpreted it. So
Is that the call that was so difficult to understand?
Right.
Okay.
And I haven't transcribed that call or posted it, but I think he made some very, very important points and certainly opened up my view of the internet from his comments on that call. But basically, he's saying that there needs to be like a mother ship that allows this contention management. So it's like, hey, you sort of like quiet the certain bells while other bells are ringing louder, or allow them to ring at whatever their natural volume is. You've got to sort of throttle back the rest of the bells that are competing for, the...
Isn't that kind of the danger right now? I mean, just like what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, Comcast and Rogers and Telefonica. I mean, these independent entities entering that particular space in the market, yet there's no federation between them to oversee some of those sorts of issues.
Well, I think that's basically what he's saying.
Yeah, okay.
That,
Because I mean, that could be a total nightmare.
Yeah. Well, and he talks about how a Skype call was breaking up at one of these events where they're talking about this very subject. But it's not just trying to carry voice traffic over the internet. It's basically the explosion of video and high-definition audio and all that is, bandwidth intensive and hungry for bandwidth and to sort out who gets priority over whom. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and right now there's no way to triage that.
Right. There's no governance structure to sort of play traffic cop for all that. So.
Now, is that something that Aaliyah and Fitzgerald and whatever will try to put together, at least from the toll-free's perspective? I mean, and present, I guess I don't even know to whom they would present their findings. Because the FCC wouldn't necessarily, they don't necessarily have any sort of governance over the internet, so.
I haven't seen any indication that they would, that's part of the plan.
Okay.
As far as I know, the contention management that Martin Geddes is talking about is fairly young, a fairly young conversation. So I think Martin Geddes is still, I think he's the biggest champion that I know of this architecture for the next internet.
But he's been talking about some of these issues for 8-10 years already, right?
Oh yeah. And he put out another piece after this a few days later talking about the next version of the internet, which he's planning to write a book about. He's calling it The Dawn of the Hypercomputer. And he's actually asking for comments on his foundations that he's talking about. But they're in that piece.
Do you have a link to whatever teaser you read on that? Obviously, if he's writing a book, there's nothing done. But where can I read more about that?
Let's see.
Or if you could post a link for everyone, that might be nice.
Yeah, I'll post a link, but I believe, I'm not even I think you got to subscribe to his newsletter to get this.
Okay.
So I'll send, let's see, Dawn of the Hypercomputer. This was circulated on May 28th, and I'm going to forward this to you, Tom. So.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I'd like to read that.
Yeah, I just sent it off to you. But, he's talking about how, this contention and some other elements that, we've been talking about for some time are required elements for the next generation of the internet. And let's see. So I'll read a little bit about this. It says, he says, he's talking about for this book he's thinking about reading or writing, says, I'm going to try out a simple idea. Quote, the internet, unquote, is a phase we use to reason about a certain kind of universal interconnectedness. There's something bigger in the background behind it. We just haven't named it yet. In absence of inspiration for something better, what may lurk in the mid-distance is the dawn of the hypercomputer. So he's actually talking about the internet being a much larger social construct than just communications and media delivery. He's talking about it being, a means for monetary transfer and, social, political communications, data, storage, all that.
This is a little bit of a bunny trail, but I don't know if it was a few weeks ago or a few months ago, you were talking about Facebook or something Facebook-like that maybe, is yet to be introduced, being that very central communication platform.
Right.
Based on the fact that that has now had its IPO and it's going down, do you think that people considering that theory, does it weaken based on what the IPO does? Does it not affect it? Does it even matter?
Well, I think it definitely matters. I think, let's say that, I think a lot of people are looking at Facebook as a method to authenticate identity. So I believe the official name for it is Facebook Connect. So there's a bunch of there's an ever-growing set of services that you start to log into, and it says, okay, do you want to log in, do you want to create an account, or do you want to connect via your Facebook account or Twitter? Those are the two. So, and we talked about this with Timothy Denton in terms of Federation of Registries, and we started to talk about it a little bit when Rich Shockey was on the Phone Word Forum, but
but Rich seemed to think that idea was absurd, correct?
Rich was not a fan of that idea that Facebook could become a sort of a de facto identity authentication source. I happen to disagree. I think that, there's a need, and that Facebook is probably the closest thing that we've got to a way to authenticate the identity of people. So, whatever's emerging, there's definitely a need for identity management, authentication. In fact, Google is, I've read that Larry Page of Google is obsessed with identity management. And, that's totally what they're out to, achieve, is a registry, a realm where identity is authenticated. And that's huge for mobile wallet initiatives, for single sign-on, for just a whole host of services.
So they want to perfect that to be more than just a direct marketing reverse.
Well, yeah, it opens up a whole.
Okay.
It opens, if you can authenticate somebody, if you're sure that who you're dealing with is who you think you're dealing with, then there's enormous repercussions in terms of security, monetary transaction, trust, access to services, all of it becomes, there's a whole set of services that become viable at that point that are, arguably not viable today because you'd have to have people continuously signing in to an account, what's your username and password.
Just because there are so many, or because they have timeouts?
Well, it's because there's so many, and because everybody's trying to, pull so many things together.
Okay.
They're trying to pull your bank account, your, data records, your preferences, and there's this explosion of devices that people are accessing all this stuff from. So, people have laptops, they've got personal computers, they've got the computer at work, they've got their tablet, they've got, their latest cell phone and maybe old cell phones that are sitting around the house. So
each person could have 5, 6, 7, 8 things to authenticate.
Right. And if you're sitting in front of your smart TV, that's essentially a computer as well. That's just a larger screen. So the only differentiating factor behind all these devices just becomes kind of like the size of the screen. As the computing power and the network connectivity increases, what you're carrying around in your pocket is just as powerful as your, desktop computer.
And that also makes why someone like Comcast would want to be participating right now.
Well, yeah. They're all grappling.
The traditional voice carriers, AT&T, those are the people that are actually behind.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Because they're trying to avoid being relegated to, what's called dumb pipes.
Mm-hmm.
They really don't have any services to speak of other than transmission. And with transmission becoming pretty much ubiquitous, they've got to distinguish themselves in terms of either service quality or security or cloud or whatever. So
makes the regulation of everything murky at best, doesn't it?
It's completely disconnected from what's happening.
Exactly.
And the other thing that's happening with the carriers, the traditional carriers, is they used to be very well defined geographically. So, AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, etc., were North America, or the United States, and something like Telefonica in Spain was Spain. But now, with this over-the-top initiative and direction, all of a sudden, anyone like Telefonica is competing on a worldwide basis. So they're no longer restricted to being a Spanish telecommunications company. They can offer services anywhere in the world. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. How do you think native spoken languages will play into that model? Telefonica, if things don't translate from Spanish to English, how do they enter this market? And does that mean that English speaking or Chinese or whatever, do the bigger languages, the more used languages, have an accidental advantage? That question.
Well, I think that circles back around to what Martin Geddes is saying is, hey, you need some umbrella over the whole thing so that, the person or the entity you're connecting with, what time zone they're in, if they're available or not available, what language do they speak, is there some sort of translation that's required in between, whomever you're connecting with, all that. So I think it's
they expect to be paid.
What's that?
The currency with which they expect to be paid, et cetera.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And are there certain things in the regulatory regime that they're subject to that need to be adhered to? All of that circles back around to the identity management, to the authentication, to the global nature of everything now. So
it seems to me in here, Geddes said something about like the ITU. Let's see, where was that? So we need a standards body like the ITU, but not the ITU. Is that really what he's saying?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Like here, no amount of work by the ITU and GSMA. We'll move the apostrophe back to make this collaborative. I guess that's not exactly what he's talking about there, but ultimately, yeah. The ITU, we need a standards body like that, but that's probably not it.
And where do you see that? What paragraph? What subheading?
PSTN does not exist in isolation at the end of paragraph 1. That's not really what he's getting at there, but just something that popped into my head there.
I don't see his reference to the ITU, but numerous people are talking about the need for something like that, like the ITU, but you're right, it's not the ITU. There's a number of considerations regarding.
In your opinion, where would that originate? Would that be a group of people like us, or a group of engineers? Would it be a group of members of the ITU, that want to form a whole different organization, or how organically does that evolve?
Well, I think the stage is set for it to evolve organically. And I think that it's possible to set that up and just basically do it. And assuming that the policies are, that enough people are aligned with the policies that are behind that initiative, it'll be adopted. If the policies are onerous and the policies, people, there's too much friction with the policies, I think it'll fail. And I think,
isn't that kind of what happened with ICANN?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, ICANN's, and I'm not an expert on ICANN, but ICANN's wrestling with some huge governance issues.
But in their early years, their formation was just that, a group of people, and that just kind of evolved into, this is kind of what we agree, yes or no, blah, 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 next, and all of a sudden it's the standard.
Right. And you can look at other examples as well. Wikipedia is an example. For that matter, Twitter and Facebook are examples where all of a sudden, an initiative's just sprung up, and it's in many respects become its own entity with its own governance set, and it's in many respects providing the services that some sort of standards-based body or authority would have created over time by committee. But the the whole committee, there's a whole bunch of different initiatives. Like the telcos are trying to put together something called Rich Communications Suite. I think it's called RCS. And that's, in my view, burdened with a huge amount of, friction and inertia and so forth.
And when you say telcos, which telcos?
Just, the standard telcos from around the world.
Oh, okay.
Dean Bubley's written quite a bit about that. And but at the same time, what we talked about last month on the real-time communications, that's a much more open platform that looks like it's poised to really revolutionize telecommunications as well as media delivery, where you're basically just using your browser as everything, your telephone, your video player, all of it. And I think that's what's really emerging. However, there's still the question of what's the addressing scheme going to be under a RTC a real-time communications platform. Is it going to be email addresses? Is it going to be telephone numbers? Is it going to be some combination? And who controls that stuff? Is it going to be the ITU? Is it going to be countries? Is it going to be ICANN? Is it going to be individuals? Is it going to be some new entity? All of that. And I don't think anybody really knows. I think when you read...
Are the RTCs in jeopardy of being sued, for example, by every state in the United States because of some sort of regulatory I don't even know how to phrase the question. What is the hindrance?
Well, the only for RTC, the only hindrance is the browsers, and since RTC is being championed by Google, and Google has Chrome as one of the leading browsers, that hindrance is melting away. So, if you looked at WebRTC, you'll see that there's a whole initiative for setting the standards and for rolling that out that's well underway. And, I'm not even sure that the regulatory side is up to speed on what's going on with that.
Well, I'm the first to admit that I know nothing about it, but I'd have to think that they're going to be pulling their hair out, because where do they even start?
Well, that's kind of the tug of war that's going on between,
Because if it is, net neutrality, or I don't know. Yeah, there are a lot of questions there.
Well, I think it's too early to say, but the capability in terms of mobile devices, in terms of open source, in terms of cloud-based capabilities is, growing at almost an unprecedented rate. And, to expect regulatory regimes to be ahead of that curve, I think is, in my view, is unrealistic.
Well, and I think Geddes is actually alluding to that here, too. Bad law is often made in haste.
Right.
I mean, things are happening so quickly that someone's just going to get reactive.
Well, I think if indeed, as he's talking about here, that there was a catastrophic failure of the PSTN, even though we'd still be talking over, phone calls and stuff like that, everything would just be routed over the internet. But let's say that there is a catastrophic failure of the PSTN. I think what he's saying in that piece is that you'd probably see some sort of knee-jerk reaction by the regulators and the, governments to try to patch the PSTN together, to keep it alive for a while there's a bit of a smoother transition.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah,
I think
he was specifically saying there wasn't based on what we're talking about here, but you can see how those two, I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's a whole lot of meaning to what he said in that comment.
Yeah, and I think, what he's saying, the realistic result would be, you're going to have this antiquated platform break, and it's not going to be repairable. Mm-hmm. People aren't going to have the incentive to repair it. They haven't had the incentive for probably at least a decade to put any kind of money into the PSTN. Everything's been moving to the Internet Protocol Network. And if the thing breaks, the best solution, which Rich Shockey's been saying, is you just shut down the PSTN ASAP, and migrate from the PSTN to the all IP network as soon as possible, and
but that's wonderful in theory, but you can't just do that in 6 minutes.
Well, I think what Martin Geddes is saying is, and Rich Shockey is, hey, we might see just how fast we can move if the thing breaks and it can't be, patched together. There just won't be any choice. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think what the toll-free industry is missing and has missed is that if the PSTN breaks today, so do all toll-free numbers.
Well, you've got. That was the play, Mrs. Lincoln.
That's right. So, because there's nothing in place to set up the calls other than the PSTN. So, at least not consistently. Now, I strongly suspect that the larger telcos are probably routing toll-free calls, point to point today, but
doesn't that still require the signaling coming out of the PSTN?
Well,
or that's a bit of an unknown.
It's unknown. But if I'm an AT&T customer and I'm dialing on my iPhone, 1-800 phone word, let's say, and 1-800 phone word is the business that's using, 1-800 phone word is also an AT&T customer, then if I was AT&T, I'd be routing that call, totally independent of the PSTN at this point. But technically,
and still charging PSTN rates.
Of course.
Yeah.
Still, charging a couple cents a minute, even though it's costing zero, or next to zero. However, particularly with toll-free numbers, a large toll-free customer, let's say 1-800-Flowers, they're going to be using a multitude of carriers and doing time-of-day routing and area routing and all that stuff. And that breaks down because the first thing that happens when you dial 1-800-Flowers today is there's a lookup in the PSTN via the SMS 800 database to say, okay, what's the provisioning associated with this number? What time of day is it? Where's this call coming from? Or, at least what's the area code of the call? So all that complexity in terms of the provisioning is PSTN-centric for toll-free numbers. And, while there might be a small portion of the traffic that can be, bypassed within an intelligent carrier lookup, assuming it's, everything's maintained within the carrier, it's not going to work for the majority of the toll-free numbers. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And
I mean, even the user in the 800-Flowers scenario, if the phone number isn't working for whatever reason, they also are perfectly aware that 1-800-Flowers.com is there, and they themselves can just decide to go in a different direction. Where if you're, I don't have an example, I guess, but an 800 number to the IRS, for tax help or something. I mean, if that number doesn't work, maybe you don't know where to go because they haven't presented to the public at large whatever their email or web address is.
Right, but it's, with something like web real-time communications, all of a sudden, you don't even, you can talk through your browser just as easily as you can see rich media through your browser.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So,
yeah, you're right.
So then there's really, it's kind of like, okay, so what? The phone number doesn't work because there's a dialer right on the website.
Right.
So, anyway, I don't know. But so, there is an initiative supposedly underway through the SMS 800 Inc. to do some sort of 2-year plan for a new web interface to the SMS 800 database. But it's only speculation on my part that might be more than just a new, prettier, website. But I would hope that based upon the budget amounts that I've heard of, that it's going to be more than just some sort of new web interface. but I'm not sure that. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that 2 years is there's that much luxury, to wait 2 years. Second of all, the efforts in the past have either taken longer than 2 years or have not worked at all.
But do you think that's because the carriers were controlling the agenda when they didn't want it? I mean, do you think that will change if the structure changes?
Well, my personal opinion, Jay Carpenter, is that if any initiative to try to take the legacy SMS 800 database and add Internet Protocol functionality is doomed to failure. And I'm not an engineer or anything else, but that I think is the temptation and has been the temptation in the past, and I think there's strong incentives to go that direction. And it's my view, and I've said this to the 800 SMS executive team, there has to be a separate architecture that's brand new, that's set up where people can migrate from the old to the new. Basically.
And how do they respond to that?
Well,
deer in the headlight, or are they receptive to that?
They heard it, and then they immediately started asking questions as to, well, how do we take, the existing database and update it, which is, exactly counter to having a brand new database or a brand new architecture that people migrate to. So, I won't go into all the incentive vectors, but
well, I mean, you're obviously more involved in participating in that sort of stuff. I mean, do you have any idea who the current RESTborgs are that have interest in running? I mean, who do you think are going to be? I mean, obviously on this call, maybe that's not the place to talk about it, but are there going to be forward thinkers presenting themselves for that new entity, for that new executive committee?
I don't know. I do.
That right there is the problem.
Well,
potentially.
I don't know. I'm, at this point, for the last 6-8 months, I've been less and less involved with the toll-free industry, the governance issues, and all that stuff. And I think that I do think that there's a growing awareness and there's a shift to the positive that, hey, something has to be done and has to be done soon, and that it's time to take a new look at toll-free numbering as well as all telephone numbering. So, which way the winds are blowing, I don't really even know. So,
right.
All right. So
well,
I think
as
we're
always, it's been an education.
Okay.
Thank you, Jay.
All right, Tom. Thank
All right,
you.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.